Hello, my name is Talib Küçükcan. I would like to welcome you to the TRT World Forum Digital Debates. Today we are going to look at the latest events in Palestine and the conflict between Israel and Palestine, where the Palestinians were the victims of Israeli escalation of violence in Gaza and in Jerusalem, in Al-Quds. Today I have got an excellent speaker. Hussam Zomrot is the guest of honor today. Let me introduce him to you first, and then we will move on to our questions. Ambassador Hussam Zomrot is the head of the Palestinian mission to the UK. He was born in a refugee camp in the Gaza Strip. He previously served as the Palestinian envoy to the US before the closure of the PLO office in Washington, D.C., instigated by President Trump in 2018. Ambassador Zomrot has since advocated that Britain spearhead the peace process in the Middle East and act as a leader in global diplomacy. And we have seen him over several times on, I think, international channels as a very effective commentator. He is the right person to talk about what will happen in Palestine. The title of our session is A New Era for the Palestinian Struggle. Ambassador Zomrot, welcome to join us today. Thank you for accepting our invitation. It's a pleasure to host you on TRT World Forum Digital Debates. Let me begin with the first question. Given that a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas has been announced, what do you see as the next logical steps for the Palestinian movement and the PLO in particular? Will there be a renewed push towards reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas? And if not, what are the barriers that would remain?
Thank you, Dr. Talib, and thank you for having me at this very prestigious platform, the global platform of the TRT World Forum. Of course, the most pressing priority for us, for the Palestinian people, for the Palestinian leadership, is to ensure that there is no going back to the situation before this latest Israeli aggression on our people. The status quo ante is unacceptable by any standards, and this means for us, number one, the absolute priority is uniting all the forces that represent the Palestinian people across the occupied territory in historic Palestine, inside the Green Line in the 48 areas, and in exile, our refugees scattered all over the region, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan, and beyond, in Europe and in the US. This is a moment of unity because the reality that have been shown by our people in the last few weeks is a reality of the unity of the purpose and the unity of the oppression for every Palestinian, and the willingness to actually stand up against the oppression and in rejecting all that Israel has been practicing over the years. This struggle now has a united people, united leadership, and united solidarity. I mean, what is happening is truly unprecedented, and this struggle has to be defined now very clearly. This is a struggle against Israel's occupation, against the ethnic cleansing, against the denial of our national and individual rights for 100 years now, since the Balfour Declaration. It's a system of discrimination by so-called Israeli law that segregates between people, that is now described by very renowned international and even Israeli human rights organizations, like the latest report by Human Rights Watch, a US-based organization, as you know, that Israel is now a full-fledged apartheid system. So we need to unite our forces, we need to unite ourselves, we need to renew our political system, and we need to seize this historic moment. Of course, elections, my friend, is very important. But since Israel is trying to prevent our democratic right, prevent holding elections in East Jerusalem, we will have to convene elections, we will have to struggle, and we need the world here to help us actually ending this practice of denying our democratic process. However, there are so many other ways and tools and means of ensuring unity, of ensuring representation, of ensuring new voices and new elements. Historically, the PLO was based on popular resistance, syndicates, unions, unions for professionals, unions for students, unions for women, unions for workers. We need to bring that about. This is a revolution, an uprising from the bottom up, and it is the moment for the people to be heard all over the world. And I have to say that what we have seen has inspired many all over, and therefore I think the priority now is that united we must focus on the disease, not the symptom. We must focus on the virus, not the coughing. And the virus is the occupation, is Israel's 73 years of denial, and the virus is the international inaction for all this long.
Well, Ambassador, thank you very much. I think you have highlighted the violations of Israeli government over the years, over the decades, actually, when it comes to the rights of the Palestinian people on the ground. But my question is to you, what concrete steps you can take in order to reconcile between Hamas and the Al-Fatah? Because you said rightly that unity is critically important in order to respond to the Israeli aggression and demand of the Palestinian people. So what would be the concrete steps in order to reconcile the difference between these two influential groups?
To continue what we have started in Istanbul and then in Cairo, the dialogue and the discussion that has led to the agreement between all political parties, including Hamas and Fatah, of convening national elections. That was a very important moment, and only recently, to continue on the path and on the experience of the unity of our people in the last few weeks, everywhere, not only in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, but also inside the 48 areas and outside in exile. I think to build on this. And to build on this in a concrete way, we really do need to enforce the will of the Palestinian people on the occupier to convene elections everywhere, including in occupied East Jerusalem. We need the world to help us do so, because I think this is about time that we revert back to our people. So the most practical solution is elections. But there are also other issues that we are looking into and we must happen. The PLO is the Palestinian legitimate representative. It's the umbrella of the Palestinian people, and the PLO represents almost all Palestinian factions except Hamas, and therefore this is a time when we have to discuss together how the PLO can include all political parties, and together we go ahead, because now there is no differences. We may differ in some methods of resistance, but there is absolutely unity of the purpose, unity of the resistance against the injustices, and we all now believe that negotiations has been futile because of Israel's practices. We need to enforce international law, not negotiate it. We need to enforce international resolutions, not discuss it. So I think today the ground is fertile for a true and actual unity in words and in deeds and inside the political system.
Ambassador Zamlot, you called for international assistance and help to the Palestinian cause and to move forward. I think the Arab world is part of that international community, but there's a lot of criticism leveled against the Arab world when it comes to this issue, especially recent normalization efforts of some of the Gulf countries with Israel. How do you think that would play out as far as the relations between the Arab world and Israel is concerned, but specifically the Palestinian issue? Because when this normalization process started, people argued that this will be in the interest of the Palestinians. Do you think that is the case, or what would be your response to such criticisms?
Well, we opposed and disagreed with the so-called Abraham Accords because we believe that by signing peace agreements with Israel, between parentheses, without demanding an end to Israel's military occupation of Palestinian land and Arab land, and without demanding the establishment of a sovereign Palestinian state in line with international resolutions and in line with Arab summit resolutions, without that demand, the countries who did so were actually undermining, not only undermining the Palestinian cause, the Palestinian position, but actually undermining Arab position, the united Arab position, as expressed by the Arab Peace Initiative in 2002, which was very clear in the content and the sequence that there will be normalization in the region once Israel ends its occupation and once the Palestinian people have gained their legitimate rights. And therefore, the so-called Abraham Accords played in the hands of Netanyahu, unfortunately, of the Israeli Prime Minister, and of Trump, because it was done by Trump and Kushner, just to show that there is some achievement in their part, that peace can happen without resolving the Palestinian issue. That was the Trump and the Netanyahu logic, and that it has been used extensively by Netanyahu inside Israel for his own public opinion and globally as part of his propaganda, suggesting that the Palestinian struggle, the Palestinian legitimate struggle for liberation, for freedom, for return, for equal rights, can be safely ignored. That was what happened. It was just an attempt to ignore the issue. And look at the statistics since the signing of these agreements. It's horrible. Israel didn't take the normalization as an opportunity to reverse its very illegal policies. It actually took it as a license to entrench and to heighten, to speed its colonization and ethnic cleansing and denial of Palestinian rights. I mean, just take one number. The year 2020, last year, was the highest in terms of the illegal settlement building in history, in the history of the Israeli illegal policies. That was just after the agreement. So unfortunately, it did not help. It has pushed Netanyahu and the Israeli right in the direction that we all oppose, which is more theft of our land, more confiscation of our rights. What I'm trying to say here is that while some Arab countries can decide on their own, what we really care about, appreciate, follow is the Arab nations, the people, the streets. And we have followed in the last few days and weeks a very inspiring scene everywhere in the Arab world, everywhere, in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, in Jordan, in Bahrain, in Oman, in Morocco, in Algeria. I mean, this is really inspiring. And by the way, it was not just a show of solidarity by words, but by deeds. You cannot imagine how much the Arab youth now are an integral part of our struggle in the media and in the social media from all over the region. And therefore, the verdict of the people of the Arab world has been delivered squarely and clearly. And that verdict is that the Palestinian cause is an Arab cause. That verdict is clear now. And this is what matters for us, my friend.
I think you said that Palestinian cause is an Arab cause. I think we have to correct that strong statement, because when you look all around the world, I think there has been support to the Palestinian case. In non-Arab Muslim world, first of all, and also in the non-Muslim world as well. What is your observation about the recent reactions all over the world? It's a global reaction, actually. This is the first time that we see such a massive reactions to the Israeli occupation and violence.
Yes, and I agree with you 100%. But you asked me about the Arab world, the Arab normalization. That's why I was focusing on the Arab side. But Palestine, historically, but it has come out so vividly in the last few weeks. Palestine is a global issue. It is an international issue. It has to do not only with Arabs and Muslims. It has to do with anybody who believes in the freedom and the equality of mankind, of the human being. I mean, we've seen inspiring events all over the world. And truly, Palestine has become the dividing line between right and wrong. Not between right and left, as in politics. No, between right and wrong. I have seen in London here, British young people, the diversity of the demonstrations suggests that Palestine, as you said, is central to the human conscience. It is central to the human spirit. It is central to the human values.
Well, I think that's a very important step, that the Palestinian issue has been now owned by the whole world rather than just one section of the world. I think we have also seen in the coverage of the media in this recent events. In your view, how has media coverage of the recent events differed from the previous ones? And what is the significance of this? As I can give an example, for example, TRT World has covered 24 hours all the events coming from the streets, and it has created a different narrative and the discourse that actually reflected the views of the people on the ground.
Yes, and we followed your coverage and the coverage of several news outlets in the region, focusing on this issue, bringing out the truth. Yet here, this is an opportunity to also talk about Western mainstream media that has really fallen into the common traps of depicting our struggle as a war between two sides, or a conflict between two sides that immediately grants some kind of equivalence to both sides. And this is simply not true. We have been suffering from this for a long time, my friend, because the framing of the whole thing is that there are two sides, and the issue is security, it's violence. Every interview I have done myself, and there were many, the starting point from, the starting point for this Western mainstream media is about rockets, Hamas. It's about Palestinian resistance. It's about Palestinian reaction. And they never pick on the Israeli action that instigates this, provokes this, calls for this. And this has got to stop. This has got to stop. We are telling the world now, don't compare between an occupied and an occupier, between a colonized and a colonizer, between a besieged and a besieger. There is no comparison. There is no two sides. There is only one side. That side is the occupier, the colonizer, the violator of the very basic human rights. The denial that is happening by one side. And also we say to the world, your words are lethal. Your words are lethal because it is putting us in a very wrong framework. Our struggle is not a fight between two equal parties. Our struggle is for liberation. It's a very legitimate struggle, and it is supported by international law. I mean, international law grants people under military occupation, people under oppression, the right to defend themselves. And this is not about both sides. Or even Israel and Hamas, because as you may have followed, they want to depict the whole situation as a fight between Israel and Hamas, when in fact it is a struggle between Israel and the Palestinian people that have lasted for 100 years. And this is about, and this is what we need to do right now with the international media, the mainstream Western media, is to correct this framework, because they use terms like militias, Palestinian gunmen, but when they talk about Israel, they say Israeli defense forces. I mean, this has been fed in for a long time. Some Western media has adopted the Israeli narrative, and we are ought to challenge this narrative. We are ought to make sure that when they talk about the Palestinian struggle, they talk about it as a struggle that is very well enshrined in international law and in international human conscience, as we just said. And we are the new generation and the new opportunities. There is one major thing for us, that we are no longer allowing anyone to dance around the truth, and the truth must be conveyed. And we need to challenge this logic, this framework, and finish it once and for all. And here, I must say, I must give my gratitude and bow for the ingenuity and the bravery, the brilliance of our Palestinian people, young and old, in utilizing social media and other means at their disposal to bringing their voices and stories to the world. And I tell you, this has made a huge difference, particularly the last few weeks.
Well, actually, that brings me to a question that you had some experience. The issue of digital censorship has come to the fore during the past week, and you yourself held an emergency meeting with Facebook officials to deliver an official complaint regarding censoring posts, deleting Palestine-related posts and accounts. How has the battle of narratives played out on the digital platforms, and how have Palestinians and activists responded? You have briefly answered that question, but I think when we talk about the clash of narratives and how censorship takes place on a global level.
I mean, social media is offering people around the world an unmediated perspective on all kinds of issues. Why did the murder, for instance, of George Floyd cause such an outrage worldwide? Because people could see with their own eyes, follow on their own tablets and machines, mobiles, what is happening. There was no editing, no intermediate intervention, no censoring. It is for this reason that social media companies have an enormous responsibility going forward to allow the free speech of people to the fullest extent possible, my friend, in order for that injustices, not only in Palestine, but worldwide, but particularly in Palestine, these injustices are finally exposed and opposed, not only by us, the Palestinians, but by what you are seeing now, a growing number of freedom-loving people by the millions worldwide. And it is for this reason I think Israel is lobbying these platforms, these social media companies, so hard, so relentlessly, every day and every night, to try and block the Palestinian content, because they know the effect of the showing of the injustice at the hands of Israel. So they are trying to block our content, and at the same time, they're lobbying these firms and these platforms to ignore the very horrific, systematic, actually, incitement and culture of hate in Israel, and by the highest ranks, including the Prime Minister of Israel, on his own social media platforms. And that's why here in the mission we met with the management of Facebook, and we delivered a very serious and strong complaint officially that we are following. What you're doing is unacceptable. You have adopted the framework, the narrative of Israel, which is the occupier, which is committing all the crimes. This framework suggests that if a Palestinian activist or a Palestinian youth mentions in one of their posts the word Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the most sacred for the Palestinians, his or her post will be deleted, his account might be removed. And we listed for them many incidents of actually adopting the Israeli narrative. And we warned that this is making the Facebook and all the platforms that follow or under the Facebook management, like Twitter, like Instagram, are actually becoming part of the problem, and they are trying to blind the rest of the world and silence the Palestinians. And at the same time, they need to take their responsibility as per international law, as private sector, and their main responsibility is to abide by international law and to fight Israeli incitement, which has led to lynching mobs in the streets of some cities, as in Jaffa and Lod and Haifa, and is leading to more Israeli Jewish mob mentality, lynching mob mentality against our people. So the charges against them are grave, and we are taking it very seriously. And there were some follow-up after that meeting here in London with our Prime Minister back in Ramallah. There was a statement by Facebook company that they have established a special center to also look into Israeli incitement. But yet, I think the road is not as easy, but the mission and the goal is possible. These companies must stop trying to silence us, must stop adopting the Israeli narrative, and must adopt the global international narrative for justice and for freedom.
Okay, now let's look at the political narrative of the leading countries in the world. What is your response to the US position in the last events? Because the Biden and the close associates and some of the spokespersons of the US government seems to have supported the Israeli position.
Well, we have had a very serious issue with the US position historically. I mean, the bias in the US is very clear. You only want to take one example. Right at the height of the aggression against our people in Jerusalem, in Gaza, and everywhere, and the bombardment, the US administration approves arms trade, arms exports to Israel worth of $750 million. And now there is a serious backlash in the US Congress and the Senate, led by Senator Sanders, to actually immediately stop this exportation of weapons because of the US law that prevents the export of arms to countries that commits and violates international law and human rights. So the US is historically biased. The US always looks at Israel as its proxy in the region. The US sees Israel as its arm to actually control, and we need to challenge this. And what we see in the region, I must say that the Biden administration is a huge improvement in comparison to the Trump administration, but the Trump administration was a very bad starting point. Yet there was a very important phone call that came from President Biden to our president. There was a good meeting yesterday between the Secretary of State Blinken and our president and leadership. The US wants to implement the two-state solution. The US opposes the settlement, the illegal settlement expansion. The US wants to reverse permanently Israel's actions in Jerusalem, particularly in Sheikh Jarrah. That's what we heard. The US opposing the provocation in Al-Aqsa Mosque and in the Old City. Okay, we agree, but we need to see US action, American action, and international action. Only action will do. Israel is now accustomed to hearing statements and cries. When the world led by key countries, including the US, starts taking action, I think Israel will heed our calls. And in fact, that's why the peace process has failed, because Israel was able to take the peace process as an opportunity to actually take more land, to colonize, to subjugate our people. And in all honesty, there was never a genuine two-state solution, my friend. People say Israel killed it. I am afraid it was never born, because Israel never accepted the international resolutions of a two-state solution in the first place. From the Rabin time to Netanyahu, settlements, illegal settlements, have only accelerated. And Israel uses the talk about peace process just to consolidate its occupation. So the truth is, we need to expose this, and we need a different US approach and international approach to Israel, because carrots and more carrots to Israel, incentives like arms trade, is not working and will never work. Only sanctions, only pressure will work when it comes to Israel.
To me, the current stalemate is some sort of status quo, as you have said, and that Israel enjoys it actually, because it's continuous colonization of the Palestinian land. In this context, then, what is the future of a two-state solution? If there is no such thing, what would be the alternative? You said that Israel never wanted a two-state solution.
Well, the most important thing is our rights. It's not about the form of the solution. Our right to self-determination is sacred, is legitimate as a nation, as a people, and that right is only blocked by Israel and its main international supporters, because we have a very well-defined occupied territory. We have a united, vivid, and rooted nation, ancient nation, and we have recognitions by more than 2/3 of the globe. 140 countries. We have a seat in the United Nations. We are a full member of UNESCO. We are a member of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, because we want to end, as a state of Palestine, we want to end this culture of impunity for Israel. We want to end Israel being above the law. We want to bring accountability and consequences. So the first right is the right to self-determination. The second right is the right of return. Our refugees scattered all over, inside the homeland and outside, including myself, by the way, my own parents. Those refugees have rights. We have rights to our property. We have rights to return. And the third right is equality. For our people inside the 1948 areas, these people are dealt with not only as second-class citizens, but even third or fourth-class citizens. You also live on TV the prosecution of our Palestinian brothers and sisters inside these cities, Yafa, Haifa, Akka, Al-Lud, even in the south, in Negev, the Naqab, in Beersheba, the Beer Saba. All these communities have been attacked, not only by the state-sponsored institutions like the army and the police, but even by mobs and by gangs. So our fight and our struggle include them and their right for full equality. So should these rights be materialized, that is fine. As for the form of solution, the PLO has accepted the international resolutions, accepted a Palestinian state on the 1967 borders. We did not call for a two-state solution as a Palestinians. Dr. Taleb, this is very important for your audience. The two-state solution was never, ever a Palestinian demand. It was a Palestinian concession. Because you know what? In 1948, we owned 95% of our own land, every home, every farm. And then they offered us less than half of our own land. And then later on, the international community said, okay, you have to accept 22%. Unfair it is, unfair and compromising it was. We accepted it because we wanted to ally ourselves with international legitimacy, international order, international system. Yet this international order has been inactive and it did not enforce its own resolutions. I will not list for you how many Security Council resolutions. I will not list for you how many hundreds of General Assembly resolutions that remain to be unimplemented. And therefore, this is what we are telling the international community. If you want a two-state solution, stop giving us lip service. Stop. We're done with that. Number one, recognize, like the UK, the US, recognize the state of Palestine. Why are you waiting for? If you call for two states and you recognize only one, which is Israel, then you give a license for that state to encroach. Number two, impose the entire will of the international resolutions by imposing sanctions, and don't continue putting Israel above the law because Israel is your friend and ally, because that destroys the very spirit of international system. Number three, we need now actions that will show Israel that you're serious, like embargo of arms trade, like banning the illegal settlement products from coming to the Western markets, European markets, American markets. And lastly, what we are telling the world now, that we don't want you to come and invite us to negotiate international law and international resolutions. We want you to come and help us implement these resolutions and the international will.
Well, thank you very much, Hussam Zomlot, Ambassador and Head of the Palestinian Mission to the UK. Thank you for joining us today, and I think we have learned a lot, and hopefully we will continue our discussion on the Palestinian case. Thank you very much, and I would like to say goodbye on behalf of TRT World Forum Digital Debates to everyone. Goodbye.